Hey there. Welcome to another deep dive.
Mm.
Today we're wading into some pretty deep waters,
Okay.
exploring the possible connection between fractality and gravity.
Okay.
It sounds a bit out there, I know, but the source material we're looking at, a discussion between physicists and engineers, makes some really intriguing claims.
Yeah.
Our mission, to break down these complex ideas and see if we can find any nuggets of insight that might actually be relevant to you.
It's definitely a journey into some unconventional thinking, that's for sure.
Right. Like, could there really be secrets to gravity hidden in the patterns of, say, a pine cone? And what's the deal with all this talk about charge collapse and the ether? Those terms sound more like science fiction than anything else.
They do have a certain ring to them, don't they? But they're key to understanding this particular perspective on gravity.
And then there's this whole thing about humans potentially being able to levitate by tapping into their own energy. That's where my brain starts to go, hold on a second, is this for real?
That's a healthy skepticism to have. It's important to approach these ideas with a critical mind.
Absolutely. So let's start with the basics. The discussion in the source material begins with a deep dive into quantum mechanics, specifically the structure of atoms. Honestly, this stuff can feel pretty intimidating.
It's true that quantum mechanics often gets a reputation for being incredibly complex, but I think we can unpack the core concepts without getting too bogged down in the math.
Okay, good, because I'm already feeling a little lost. They
Yeah.
keep mentioning things like quantum numbers and the Schrödinger wave equation, and my brain is starting to hurt.
I hear you. Let's break those down. Think of quantum numbers as labels for the electrons within an atom. They describe things like the electron's energy level and its angular momentum.
Okay, that makes a little more sense. But what about the Schrödinger equation? Isn't that something only super geniuses can understand?
Well, it is a complex mathematical equation, but it's essentially a way to describe how electrons behave like waves. And here's where it gets really interesting. The source material claims a connection between the solutions to this equation and the golden ratio.
Wait, the golden ratio? As in that mathematical concept that shows up in art, nature, architecture? What does that have to do with electrons?
That's the surprising part. The golden ratio often appears in fractal patterns, those self-similar structures you see in everything from ferns to coastlines. The fact that it seems to be linked to the behavior of electrons, according to the source material, hints at a potential underlying geometric order to the quantum world.
Okay, that's kind of mind-blowing. So are they suggesting that the universe is built on these fundamental fractal patterns?
Yeah, that seems to be the direction they're heading in. And this is where they bring in the pine cone analogy.
Okay, now I'm really curious. How on earth do pine cones fit into all of this?
Well, pine cones have a distinctive spiral pattern, right?
Right.
The source material uses this spiral as a visual representation of how energy waves might converge and potentially accelerate as they move through a fractal structure.
So they're not saying that pine cones actually have anything to do with gravity.
It's more of an analogy to help visualize the concept of energy flowing and intensifying along fractal pathways.
I'm starting to see the picture, but I have to admit, it still feels a bit abstract.
I agree. It's definitely a complex idea. Let's try to ground it a little more by diving into some of the other terms they use, like charge collapse.
Yes, please. That's one I've been wondering about.
Well, in simple terms, charge collapse is the idea that the attraction between positive and negative charges, like the protons and electrons in an atom, is actually a result of a kind of energy implosion.
So it's not that these charges are pulling on each other from a distance, but rather that they're collapsing in on themselves.
That's a great way to put it. And this idea of charge collapse ties into their concept of gravity.
Okay, I'm following you so far. So how does this relate to gravity?
The source material suggests that a perfected charge collapse, potentially aided by a hypothetical medium they call the ether, might be the fundamental mechanism behind gravity.
The ether. Now that sounds like something straight out of an old sci-fi movie.
It does have a vintage ring to it, doesn't it? The ether was a concept that physicists used to believe filled space and allowed for the transmission of light. While it's largely been discarded in modern physics, the source material we're looking at seems to be suggesting that it might still have a role to play.
So are they trying to bring back the ether?
It's not entirely clear. They might be using the term in a slightly different way than it was originally understood.
This is definitely getting into some pretty unconventional territory.
It certainly is. And it gets even more interesting when they start talking about levitation.
Okay, that's where I really start to get skeptical. Are they seriously saying that people can levitate?
That seems to be one of the claims, yes. They propose that individuals like certain saints who are said to have levitated might have been able to achieve this by mastering their own internal energy.
Now, how is that even possible? Are they talking about some kind of mystical energy field?
They describe it as a state of extreme energy concentration within the body, likening these energy centers to black holes.
Whoa, black holes inside us.
Again, it's likely an analogy, but it points to the idea that there might be levels of energy within us that we're not fully aware of.
This is definitely pushing the boundaries of what I thought was possible.
It certainly challenges conventional thinking, doesn't it? But that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating. We're exploring ideas that might seem out there, but they force us to question our assumptions about the nature of reality.
I agree. So if we can supposedly manipulate gravity with our minds, why aren't we all levitating right now?
That's a great question. And it leads us to another debate that emerges in the source material: the role of technology versus our own innate abilities.
Oh, so they're saying it might be about more than just having the right technology, but also about developing our inner potential.
Exactly. They explore the possibility that we might already possess the potential to do incredible things like levitate, but that we haven't fully tapped into it yet.
That's a pretty empowering thought, but also a little daunting. If we have all this potential locked away inside us, how do we even begin to access it?
That's a question we'll continue to explore as we dive deeper into the source material.
This is already a lot to process, but I'm hooked. What are your thoughts so far? What's standing out to you in all of this?
I'm finding the connections they're drawing between seemingly disparate ideas like quantum mechanics and the golden ratio particularly intriguing. It raises the possibility that there's a deeper, more elegant order to the universe than we currently understand.
It definitely makes you wonder if we're just scratching the surface of what's truly possible. I'm eager to see what other surprises this source material has in store for us.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the fascinating world where fractality might just hold the key to understanding gravity.
You know, I have to admit, the idea that saints might have levitated because they were somehow more fractal than the Earth still feels a bit like science fiction to me.
It's definitely a bold claim and one that pushes the boundaries of our current scientific understanding.
Exactly. So how do they even explain that concept? What does it mean for a person to be more fractal than the Earth?
Remember how we were talking about pine cones and their spiral patterns as a visual analogy for fractal structures?
Yes, I remember. It's still a bit hard to wrap my head around how that relates to a person, though.
Think of it this way. If fractality is about self-similarity across different scales, then perhaps a person's internal energy, the way it's structured and organized, could also exhibit fractal qualities.
Okay, so they're saying that a person's energy, their consciousness, could become organized in a way that's similar to the patterns we see in nature.
That's the idea. And the source material suggests that if someone's internal energy becomes structured in a highly fractal way, it could interact with the Earth's gravitational field differently.
So it's not just about the amount of energy a person has, but the way that energy is arranged, the geometry of it.
Precisely. And this is where the idea of charge collapse comes back into play. Remember, it's the concept that gravity arises from a kind of implosion of energy, a perfect collapse of charge.
Right, I remember. It's like those positive and negative charges aren't pulling on each other, but rather collapsing in on themselves.
Exactly. And the source material connects this idea of charge collapse to fractality and consciousness. They suggest that the more coherent and fractal our internal energy becomes, the closer we get to that ideal state of charge collapse.
And they're saying that this could potentially lead to levitation.
That seems to be the implication. They're suggesting that by aligning our internal energy in a highly fractal and coherent way, we might be able to tap into a deeper level of interaction with gravity.
It's a pretty radical idea, isn't it? I mean, it completely changes how we think about the relationship between our minds, our bodies, and the physical world around us.
It definitely challenges conventional thinking. And while it's important to approach these ideas with a healthy dose of skepticism, I find it fascinating to consider the possibilities.
Me too. It makes you wonder if there's more to reality than we currently perceive. But if this is even remotely true, why aren't we seeing more examples of it?
That's a great question. And it leads us to another interesting point raised in the source material: the role of technology in this whole equation.
Oh, right. I remember them touching on that. Are they saying that technology might be holding us back from accessing these abilities?
They present a sort of crossroads. On one hand, technology could potentially help us understand and harness these principles in new ways.
Right, like using some kind of advanced technology to amplify or manipulate our energy fields.
Exactly. But they also suggest that our reliance on technology might be a distraction from developing our own innate abilities.
So it's like we're so focused on creating external tools that we've forgotten to look within.
That's one way to interpret it. The source material seemed to be advocating for a balance, exploring the potential of technology while also cultivating our own inner potential.
It makes you think about all those stories from ancient traditions about saints levitating, yogis performing incredible feats, and various spiritual practices focused on harnessing internal energy.
Right. There are all sorts of accounts throughout history that suggest humans might be capable of much more than we typically give ourselves credit for.
It's almost as if these ancient traditions had a deeper understanding of these principles, an understanding that we're only now beginning to rediscover.
I think that's a fascinating perspective. It raises the question of whether there's a hidden truth behind some of these stories and practices, a truth that modern science is only now beginning to glimpse.
It's definitely a compelling thought, and it brings us back to that core concept of fractality. If it really is the key to unlocking the secrets of gravity and consciousness, what are the implications?
The possibilities are truly mind-boggling. On a scientific level, imagine harnessing the power of fractality for things like energy generation, transportation, or even communication.
It's like opening up a whole new realm of physics and engineering. And on a personal level, if our own consciousness is inherently fractal, what does that say about our potential?
It suggests that we might be capable of far more than we currently realize. The source material hints at things like astral travel, remote viewing, and even manipulating matter with our minds.
Wow, that's getting into some pretty wild territory.
It is, and it all stems from the idea that if we can tap into this underlying fractal structure of reality, the boundaries of what's possible become much more expansive.
Okay, so if fractality is the key, how do we unlock its potential? What are the practical steps we can take to harness this power?
That's where the source material gets a bit more speculative. They emphasize the importance of coherence, of aligning our internal energy and intentions with the fractal patterns of the universe. They talk about practices like meditation, visualization, and energy work as potential ways to achieve this.
So it's about more than just understanding the concepts intellectually. It's about cultivating a certain state of being.
Exactly. It's about aligning our inner world with the outer world, finding that point of resonance where we can tap into a deeper level of reality.
They also mention some pretty intriguing technologies that could potentially enhance this process. Do you remember those?
Yes, they talk about things like phase conjugate mirrors and plasma imploders.
Okay, those definitely sound like something out of a science fiction movie. What are they supposed to do?
Well, phase conjugate mirrors, from what I understand, are a type of mirror that can reflect light in a way that cancels out distortions. The source material suggests that this technology could be used to focus and amplify energy in a way that might help us interact with gravity differently.
And what about those plasma imploders?
Plasma imploders are devices that create a concentrated burst of energy by imploding plasma. The source material seems to think they could have applications in areas like energy generation and propulsion, possibly even tapping into this idea of charge collapse that we were talking about.
It sounds like they're proposing a kind of fusion of science and spirituality, combining advanced technology with inner practices to access a deeper level of reality.
That's a great way to put it. It's about using all the tools at our disposal, both internal and external, to explore the full potential of human consciousness and its connection to the universe.
This has been a wild ride so far. We've gone from quantum mechanics to levitation to ancient traditions to futuristic technologies. I'm really curious to hear what the source material has to say about specific examples and scientific evidence that support these mind-bending claims.
Me too. Let's dive into that in our final segment.
Okay, so we've been on this incredible journey exploring the connection between fractality and gravity, and we've encountered some pretty wild ideas along the way. But now I'm really curious to know what kind of evidence they actually present to back up these claims. Do they have anything concrete, or is it all just speculation?
It's a good question to ask. And to be fair, a lot of what they're proposing is still very theoretical. But they do point to some interesting scientific findings that seem to support their ideas.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me more.
Well, remember how they were talking about the connection between the golden ratio and the solutions to the Schrödinger equation?
Yeah, that was the part where I started to think, Okay, this is getting a bit too out there for me.
It does sound pretty wild, I'll admit. But they actually give a specific example from quantum mechanics that hints at this connection. They point to the hydrogen atom, which is the simplest atom, with just one proton and one electron. When physicists solve the Schrödinger equation for the hydrogen atom, the solutions involve a series of numbers called quantum numbers.
Right, we talked about those earlier. They describe things like the energy level of the electron.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that these quantum numbers, when arranged in a certain way, seem to exhibit a relationship to the golden ratio.
So they're saying that this fundamental mathematical constant, which shows up all over the place in nature, is also woven into the very fabric of the atom.
That's what they're suggesting. And it's not just a coincidence. The golden ratio is often associated with fractal patterns, which reinforces their idea that fractality might be a fundamental principle at work in the universe, even at the quantum level.
Okay, I'm starting to see how the pieces fit together, but how does this quantum stuff relate to gravity?
That's where things get even more interesting. They bring up a long-standing puzzle in physics called the proton radius puzzle.
The proton radius puzzle? I've never heard of that.
It's basically a discrepancy between different experimental measurements of the size of a proton. Scientists have been trying to pin down the exact radius of a proton for decades, but they keep getting slightly different results depending on the method they use.
So there's no consensus on how big a proton actually is.
Not exactly, and that's where the source material comes in. They propose that this discrepancy might be due to the proton having a fractal structure.
Wait, a fractal proton? What does that even mean?
It means that the proton's size might not be a fixed value, but rather something that changes depending on the scale at which you're measuring it. Kind of like how the length of a coastline seems to get longer the closer you zoom in because of all the inlets and coves.
So they're saying that the proton is like a miniature coastline, constantly changing its shape depending on how you look at it.
It's a fascinating idea, and it would certainly explain why scientists keep getting different measurements for the proton's radius.
That makes sense. But how does a fractal proton connect to gravity?
Well, remember how they were talking about charge collapse as the potential mechanism behind gravity?
Yes, the idea that those positive and negative charges are imploding in on themselves rather than attracting from a distance.
Right. If the proton has a fractal structure, as they suggest, it could affect how that charge collapse occurs. The way the energy is distributed within the proton, its fractal geometry, could influence the strength and nature of the gravitational field it generates.
Okay, I think I'm starting to follow their logic. They're basically saying that the structure of matter itself, down to the subatomic level, might be influencing how gravity works.
Exactly. And they go even further, suggesting that there might be ways to manipulate this fractal structure to influence the flow of energy and potentially even control gravity.
Now that sounds like something straight out of a superhero movie.
I know, right? But they actually bring up some specific technologies that they believe could be used to harness these principles. They talk about things like phase conjugate mirrors and plasma imploders.
We touched on those before. Remind me again what they are and how they fit into all of this.
Well, phase conjugate mirrors, as I mentioned earlier, are a special type of mirror that can reflect light in a way that cancels out distortions. The source material suggests that this technology could be used to focus and amplify energy, potentially creating powerful beams of coherent energy.
Okay, and they think this could be used to manipulate gravity.
They seem to think it's a possibility. They also talk about plasma imploders, which are devices that create concentrated bursts of energy by imploding plasma. They suggest that this technology could be used to achieve a controlled form of charge collapse, potentially mimicking the process that they believe creates gravity.
So they're not just talking about abstract theories, they're actually proposing concrete ways to test and explore these ideas using real technology.
Yes, and that's what I find so exciting about this source material. They're not just armchair theorists. They're actively looking for ways to put these ideas into practice and see what happens.
It's definitely pushing the boundaries of what we currently consider possible. But even if only a fraction of what they're proposing turns out to be true, the implications are enormous.
Absolutely. It could revolutionize our understanding of physics, open up new possibilities for energy generation and space travel, and even change the way we think about our own consciousness and its connection to the universe.
This has been an incredible deep dive. We've explored some truly mind-bending concepts from the quantum world to the nature of gravity, from ancient traditions to futuristic technologies. It's a lot to take in, but it definitely leaves you with a sense of wonder and possibility.
I agree. It really makes you question everything you thought you knew about the universe and our place in it.
And that's what the deep dive is all about, challenging our assumptions, expanding our horizons, and exploring the unknown. So to all our listeners out there, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep your minds open to the infinite possibilities that surround us. Who knows what incredible discoveries await us just around the corner?